morning and welcome to our September Dean's Book Review, White by Race. My name's Elizabeth Kronk Warner and I have the privilege of being the Dean at the S.J. Quinney College of Law. And we're really glad that you can start off your day with us here to talk about this book and this important topic. So as I like to do, before we get into our discussion, I do want to acknowledge that the land that I'm coming to you on, which is in the Salt Lake Valley, is the traditional lands of many indigenous tribes. And we here at the University of Utah acknowledge that this land, which is named for the Ute tribe, is the traditional and ancestral homeland of the Shoshone, Paiute, Goshute, and Ute tribes. The University of Utah recognizes and respects the enduring relationship that exists between many indigenous peoples and their traditional homelands. We respect the sovereign relationship between tribes, states, and the federal government, and we affirm the University of Utah's commitment to a partnership with Native nations and urban Indian communities through research, education, and outreach activities. So it seems really appropriate that we should be engaged in this outreach activity today. And it's my privilege to welcome and introduce our speakers who are going to be discussing White by Law, the legal construction of race. And it's a really interesting book examining what it means to be white and really getting into this heart of race as a social construction, because as our panelists will talk, we'll see about how identity and what somebody's race was changes over time. And we selected this book because it's in celebration of September, which is National Hispanic-Latinx Heritage Month. And White by Law was first published in 1996 to immense critical acclaim and really established the author as one of the most exciting and talented young minds in the legal academy. It was the first book to fully explore the social and specifically legal construction of race. And it inspired a generation of critical race theorists and others interested in the intersection of race and the law. So I'm really pleased that we have three amazing panelists who are joining us today to talk about the book and to talk about topics inspired by the book. So our first speaker is going to be Arturo Thompson, who is Dean of Career Development here at the S.J. Quinney College of Law. And he's really going to start us off with an overview and a discussion of the book. He is then going to be followed by Nicolas Wilde, class of 2015. So we're excited to have one of our alums back, who's an associate at Armstrong, Teasdale, LLP. And last but certainly not least is Professor Jorge Contreras, who is a professor and presidential scholar here at the S.J. Quinney College of Law. They're each going to speak for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then that'll leave us time for questions and answers at the end of their presentations. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you should see a button that says Q&A. So if you have a question at any time, you don't need to wait until they're done. Feel free to enter in a question and I will ask those questions and moderate the question and answer at the end of their presentations. So with that, it's my privilege to turn it over to Dean Thompson. Dean Thompson?
Thank you. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for being here. I'm super excited to present today and to frankly be presenting with my esteemed colleagues. So yeah, I'm going to sort of cover the book in context so that it may actually help with the two follow-on speakers as they're talking about sort of separate issues that relate to, I think, to the topics that Ian Haney López raises. And so, again, it's an overview, but the focus here is on race, no surprise, and race as law, as the dean described. And this idea that it's a social construct, right? It's this thing that we make up, and for a variety of reasons. But in this context, he's really focused on how the law has been used to construct race, and he has this definition, right? And there's sort of three features. And I think this is important to understanding what the author is getting at. So the first one is that physical features and lines of descent that society is invested with racial meaning. So whether your skin is black, whether your hair is kinky or your hair is straight, whether your eyes are blue or your eyes are brown, whatever that is, those get infused with racial meaning over time. And that's societal construct, right? They in and of themselves are not meaningful, but we invest them with a kind of meaning that then we take in and begin to process. And so that gets to the second point. The socialized process of ascribing racialized meaning to faces and forebears lie at the heart of racial fabrication. So the idea is you manufacture the idea of racism by the way you engage with people based on assigning these sort of meanings to someone who has a black face versus a white face, someone who may be of Asian descent versus of European descent versus maybe of some other quote unquote race. And then once you get into that, you get to this third point, right? These meaning systems that have been constructed socially by us, well, originally only sort of ideas, right? They exist as sort of pure concepts in our head. Because of the way that they're reproduced and because of the way that they're implemented in society, it then affects how material and other things are shared in society, right? And they're also self-reinforcing. There's as we talk about the prerequisite cases in a second, one of the effects of that was not only to decide who could be naturalized and who would be white, but it also defined who could enter the country in effect. And so you keep reinforcing these divisions and essentially creating a country that's essentially white with this subset of people who are black, who are then subject to this pretty pernicious system. And so moving forward, let's talk about those prerequisite cases. And this is a whole series of cases that start from fairly early in the creation of the United States, in and through the Jim Crow era and beyond. And in the original sort of constitutional concept of this, you basically, to be naturalized in the U.S., the way the legislature had created the laws, you either had to be white or you had to be black. There were no other options. And so the white thing, obvious, I think, the Europeans came here, they consider themselves to be white. Black, also obvious, people who were brought over from Africa against their will to be enslaved. But as you get rid of slavery and they are now citizens, you have to reconceptualize, right? So you create this white, this black dichotomy. The prerequisite cases really deal with the struggle of who doesn't easily fit into either category. And so, as you look at this, the presumption is by the courts, and I think in many cases, arguably by the petitioners, we'll talk about them in a second, that to be white is to be a part of the superior race. Either you believe they are in fact superior because they're white, or they receive all these other benefits. And so you want to be, if you're going to be made naturalized into this country, you want to be naturalized as white because you get those benefits. If you're naturalized as black, you essentially have pushed yourself into a class in this society that won't receive those benefits and is sort of pointedly denied those benefits. So you have these petitioners, and they are seeking the right to be naturalized as white. And so who are those people? Oftentimes they are of Asian descent, be it East Asian descent or from the Indian subcontinent region, or sometimes they are folks from the Middle East. And the cases are interesting because there's this immense struggle that goes back and forth that the courts are trying to figure out what white means without ever actually saying what white means. What they really end up doing is saying white is defined as by what it is not, right? So if you're not in the club, that establishes the boundary of what whiteness is, or you are in the club, but it never intrinsically defines what whiteness is. And that's going to be important later on because of something called white transparency and the idea of whiteness in Haney López's book. But for now, just know this concept, right, that it's defined by the boundary, not intrinsically. And in doing that, the courts sort of fly between quote unquote science, and I put science in quotes there not because I'm quoting out of the book, but because I mean it a little bit sarcastically. There's a lot of folks who were sort of amateur naturalists, racialists, whatever they claim to be, who tried to ascribe this meaning to, again, these sort of facial features or lineage features that we talked about in the prior slide. And so those folks had tried to set up this schema that said, oh, so this is what a white person is, and it's based on heritage, and it's based on all of this quote unquote science. And then here's what a black person is, and here's what whomever is, and then the struggle becomes Asians, right? So how do you classify them? And there's a series of cases in there, which I won't get into in detail, but where there's one that involves two cases that are decided in the same term, I think, by the Supreme Court. And in the first case, they go to science, right? So there's this lineage, and they're following it, and they say, oh, well, so this dictates that this person must not be white because they don't come from Aryan descent, right? And so therefore we classify them out. And then about 3 months later or whatever it is, they get this next case. And suddenly, arguably, that person does come from Aryan descent. Now, that we could get into the concept of what Aryan descent is. But in the second case, this was a person from India who makes this claim and asserts that based on this prior case where the decision had come down, clearly I should be classified as white and permitted to enter the country naturalized as white. And the court completely flips and says, actually, the science thing maybe doesn't work. We're going to go by common knowledge. And, you know, in my background, which prior to law was in communication and communication theory, common knowledge is always sort of the convenient place to go when you don't actually have anything, you know, any evidence to support your point. And so common knowledge is a comfortable place for racism as well. And I think that's how the courts use the common knowledge test. And basically it comes out to, well, everybody knows, and everybody means white Americans who have been naturalized, knows that someone from India can't be white. So therefore you can't be white. And then there's some tension that goes back and forth. But fundamentally, I think that's what these cases get at. And again, the really important thing here, well, that's not true, the really important thing, but one of the really important things here is, again, that whiteness is never defined intrinsically unto itself. It is always defined by who gets in or who's kept out of that, for lack of a better term, club. So what does all that mean? So I think what Haney López argues, and I think I agree with him, is when you create that construct, right, and you define who's white and who isn't, and then you begin to attach values and meaning to that. So it's access to resources, it's redlining and all these other issues. You begin to divide up the material, the benefits of being in society. And you establish white as the normative status and everything that is non-white as being non-normative. And so this goes on for over, you know, for a century or more, well, certainly more than a century. And you continue to allocate all these benefits to people who fall within that white category, denying those benefits to anyone who falls outside. If they're Black, they're certainly being denied because of their status within society. And then for the people who are caught in the lacuna, the space between white and Black, they're being denied because they can't even become naturalized, and oftentimes find themselves being thrown out of the country bodily, and at times having been naturalized and then denaturalized, thrown out of the country. And in fact, there was a long-standing rule that if you were a woman and you married a man who was not a naturalized citizen and didn't qualify for either white or Black, and then choose that option, and was permitted to enter, your citizenship was stripped of you, right? So the idea was to really constrain us to this community in this sort of binary form in which the benefits go to whites. And I think that's what I'm trying to illustrate with the graphic here. As this continues to go on, access to material, the effects of things like redlining, the effects of the ability to pass on intergenerational wealth, which are often attached to things like home ownership and business ownership, the deleterious effects of the outsized incarceration of non-whites in this country, and especially Blacks, versus whites for arguably the same crime, and the level of punishment being different. And then those harms are enforced, right? And they're enforced through both coercion and violence against non-whites, and that's oftentimes legitimized by the court either explicitly because they don't punish the people who engage in those activities, or implicitly and sort of culturally because they're reinforcing these ideas that A, the racial divisions are real, that B, I think whites are in fact superior is the argument that they're making. And so that the harm caused to them to the non-whites is not significant. You know, and I think that there's a tension in this country, and it's an ongoing tension about whether or not this in fact goes on, or are we overreaching. I was just watching a program last night about, there's a young woman who was doing a van life thing with her boyfriend. She has disappeared, and I think the presumption is she's been murdered. And they're looking for him, and it's captured the attention of the media, and it's on every story. It shows up in the New York Times. It shows up on the press. It shows up on TV, on the internet. Meanwhile, the number of, in this case, was specifically speaking to the number of Native American women who are murdered, and their murderers are never found, they get absolutely no attention. And so I really do think that this is pervasive, this division in society, this valuing of life, and then the valuing of assets. And so I think this is what Ian Haney is dealing with. The final sort of concept that I think is where he sort of comes to when he talks about, and it's a little bit prescient, right? It's a little bit forward looking because the book was in 96. He modified the book in 06. So we're still talking over a decade ago. But he specifically talks to this move towards so-called colorblind justice. And I think he really does sort of attack it full force, and I think with good reason. Because the idea of colorblindness, it was never embraced when it would have denied the access to whites for the purposes of white supremacy to those resources that they had. Rather, it's adopted once, speaking overtly about race and racist ideas became socially unacceptable. Maybe that happened somewhere, depending on who you are, somewhere between the 40s and the 70s for the vast majority of the population. But by adopting this colorblind system, right, what it does is it ossifies, it locks in the benefits that are already afforded to whites. So it ignores privilege, it ignores material, the space apportioned to them. It legitimizes the status quo, right, perpetuating the benefits to the whites, the burdens, and or the lack of benefits to non-whites. And it rejects and outlaws restorative or compensatory schemes, right? So from that you get the sort of the attacks on affirmative action and the outlawing of affirmative action and sort of things related to that. And again, it perpetuates this status quo. And this is what Haney López said he thinks is going to happen. And I think it is, in fact, what has happened under the cover of colorblindness, which is in fact just a way for the same group of people who receive the benefits to continue to perpetuate those benefits. And I think that's a pretty broad review of the book and what he does. I do think Haney López was pretty forward-looking. I think, even he would admit in the roughly 15 years since he did his last revision, things have changed. But I don't think he would say, and I don't think I would say, that they have changed in a way that makes this no longer a relevant argument. And I think when we look at what happened over the last couple of years, really commencing with social awareness around the George Floyd murder, and then the activities of Black Lives Matter and other organizations, these issues of race and access to justice and access to all the other benefits are very real. I think that's sort of the full length of my part of the book review. Nick, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I was just going to say that was a great summary, much better than I could have done. Thank you so much. What I'm going to talk about today is the illegal reentry statute and how that statute may have origins in racial animus and how the statute relates to some discussion by the author of topics discussed in his book. And you may be wondering, well, why am I talking about this statute here today? And as you can see on the slide, I give pretty much two reasons. One, I was trying to come up with a topic that related to Hispanic Heritage Month, and the illegal reentry statute, at least one federal district judge has found, has a disparate impact on Latinx persons. So I thought it was of topical interest during this month. And the second reason is that, like the historical racially restrictive naturalization laws that the author discusses, there is at least some evidence that the illegal reentry statute's passage was motivated by a desire to exclude those who lawmakers considered to be non-white. And one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this was when I finished the book, I had a question in my own mind about whether the topics discussed had any real relevance today. And I was trying to think in my own mind about whether or not there were any laws that were still in effect today that also intentionally were passed with the intention of excluding those that lawmakers considered to be non-white. And so that's why I wanted to talk about this. So as you can see on the screen, I'd like to proceed basically in 7 steps. I'd like to first discuss the author's discussion of the deliberate exclusion of those that lawmakers considered to be non-white. like to briefly discuss the historical role of eugenics in influencing immigration policy in our country. Just briefly touch on the elements of the statute, the illegal reentry statute, and what the maximum penalty is under that statute. Then I'd like to discuss a federal district court case that has a very lengthy and detailed discussion of the origins of the illegal reentry statute. And then I'd like to talk about the background of that law, and then the parallels between that law and issues discussed by Haney López in his book. And then I'd like to invite the audience to consider the possibility that there are other areas of existing law that may be a product of this sort of dark chapter in our country's history. And before I start talking, I want to emphasize that just because I quote the author doesn't necessarily mean that I agree or disagree with his viewpoints. Similarly, in discussing the case, I don't necessarily agree that it's the correct legal outcome, or I'm not going to go into whether I think it's going to be upheld on appeal. I only raise the issue to ask the audience to consider the possibility that we still have existing laws that tie directly to some of the topics that were discussed in the book. And finally, I want to make clear that I'm not passing any judgment on prosecutors or on judges for prosecuting these cases or sentencing defendants under this statute. I, of course, recognize that prosecutors and judges have an obligation and a duty to uphold the law that Congress has passed. So I just want to make that very clear before I go into these topics. So first, starting with Haney López's discussion of the exclusion of non-whites from our country, I think one of the underlying themes and what is discussed throughout the book is that historically, laws were passed explicitly to exclude those that lawmakers considered to be non-white, and this was very much by design. And his viewpoint is that the country as it exists today and the racial makeup as it exists today is a product of choices that lawmakers made in the past. And I think he would agree that if those lawmakers hadn't made those choices, we would probably have a country that looks a little bit differently than it does today. We'd probably have a little bit more diversity than we do today. So turning to eugenics, the author states that one ideology previously rationalized in white dominance in the United States was eugenics. And as you can see on the screen, I'm quoting Justice Thomas here, who explained what eugenics is and its origins. And basically, it's a theory that promotes the reproduction of certain groups over other groups. And here, I think it's pretty clear that lawmakers during the 1920s had a preference to promote the reproduction of people that they considered to be white and to limit the reproduction of people that they considered to be non-white. I think there's pretty strong evidence of that I don't think anyone would reasonably dispute. And the last note, I'm quoting a judge from the Sixth Circuit that says pretty plainly that during this time, eugenics was both policy-driven and widely adopted. So turning to the elements of Section 1326 offense, you can see them on the screen. Pretty much the statute punishes, and I think some would argue pretty punitively, those who illegally reenter the country after having previously been deported. The maximum penalty is up to 20 years if the defendant has a previous aggravated felony. Just keep that in mind when you consider the conduct that the defendant's actually engaging in compared to other conduct. The penalties can be, in my view, quite high. So turning to the federal district court opinion, this was an opinion out of the District of Nevada. And here, an alien defendant charged with illegal reentry moved to dismiss the indictment on the grounds that the illegal reentry statute violated the equal protection guarantee of the Fifth Amendment. The court ultimately granted his motion, holding that the statute was enacted with a discriminatory purpose, that it had a disparate impact on Latinx persons, and the judge held that the government failed to show that Section 1326 would have been enacted absent racial animus. And I think most relevant to Haney López's book is the court's discussion of the discriminatory intent that the lawmakers had in passing the statute. And I'll turn to that in my next slide. So the illegal reentry statute was enacted in 1952. Prior to its enactment, Congress first criminalized unlawful reentry in 1929 as part of the Undesirable Aliens Act. And I would just reiterate for the audience that this was during a time when eugenics was quite popular in the United States. And the court held that, I guess I also want to make clear for the audience that the statute that was actually at issue was the one that was passed in 1952, but the court in this decision decided to consider the background of the 1922 statute because she found that the taint from the 1922 statute and the racial animus, the obvious racial animus that inspired passing that law could still be seen in the 1952 statute. So the discussion that I want to turn to really is the fact that in passing the 1929 bill, there was pretty strong evidence that eugenics played a big part in passing the illegal reentry statute of 1929. And I'll just quote from a hearing that is relevant here, where a well-known eugenicist suggested that immigration control is the greatest instrument which the federal government can use in promoting race conservation, and compared drafters of deportation laws to successful breeders of thoroughbred horses. And ultimately, the court held that 1952 statute was passed with a discriminatory purpose, in large part because the 1952 reenactment did not cleanse Section 1326 of its racist origins. And I guess the point I'm trying to make in this discussion is just to have the audience consider the fact that we still have laws in existence that have a direct lineage to these times and some of the more shameful aspects of our history. And just in drawing parallels between what's discussed in the book and the statute at issue, I think both pretty clearly demonstrate that lawmakers historically have had a desire and have made deliberate choices to exclude or attempt to exclude groups who they consider to be non-white. I think a lot of the discussion in the book is about just that. So what I'd leave the audience with is just an invitation to consider the possibility that there are other existing laws that were passed or were made with the specific purpose of excluding non-whites, not necessarily in existing statutes, but also in existing case law that still affects how the world is today and how we got to this point. So I think my message would be to just examine history and see how we got here. And I think when you do that, you realize the effects of the choices of the past are still very much present today. And with that, I'd turn the floor to Professor Contreras, and thank you for your time.
Great. Well, thank you so much for that background and really important linkage of the book to what's happening today. Well, thanks. So first, let me thank the dean and the school for inviting me to talk about this. I had not read Haney López's book, even though I had known of it. And so this occasion and this event caused me both to read a classic in the literature and also to reflect on it a little bit, actually more than a little bit, based on my own background and experience of some of these issues. And so I'll share some of that with you today. And as Arturo intimated in his introductory remarks, I will go a bit further afield than the book here. And so let's see. Right. And so one thing that the book did cause me to reflect about quite a bit is what do racial classifications mean? Not so much in the white versus non-white context that the book focuses on, but in the context of being Hispanic or Latinx, which ties in to the Latino and Hispanic Heritage Month that we are recognizing now. So as many of you may know, my dad immigrated to the United States from Cuba. He met my mother here in the US and I was born here. Cubans generally are considered Hispanic, by most standards. But why is that? And how do we think about this in the context of other people who are considered Hispanic? So if you look at Cuba, it's in the Caribbean. The population, the ancestry of the population generally descends from the Spanish colonists who arrived with Christopher Columbus, and thereafter, as well as Africans who were brought over to work as enslaved laborers for a long time in Cuba. There is not an appreciable indigenous population in Cuba. The Spanish killed, basically, committed atrocious genocide in Cuba and many of the Caribbean islands with respect to the native population. But let's look at other areas where Hispanic people come from. Mexico. Like Cuba, Spanish is spoken predominantly in Mexico today, though other languages are spoken. There is a significant group of people with indigenous heritage, as well as people with heritage from the Spanish colonizers of the 16th century. Another Caribbean island very nearby, Cuba, is Hispaniola, which happens to be divided into two countries, Haiti and the Dominican Republic. There, the French settled the western part of the island, the Spanish, the eastern part. The history, of course, is complex, but today we have two countries on this relatively small island. People of African descent are there, as well as descendants of the French and Spanish colonizers. And then let's think about Brazil, a very large country, of course, in South America, thanks to the Treaty of Tordesillas and other historical events settled by the Portuguese rather than the Spanish. Portuguese is a dominant language, a large indigenous population with indigenous ancestry, Portuguese as well as Africans. So who of these are considered Hispanic in general parlance today? Well, Cubans, Mexicans, possibly Dominicans in some respects are considered Hispanic. Some would throw Brazilians into this mix if you consider living or coming from someplace in so-called Latin America to qualify you as Latinx. Some would, some wouldn't. We generally wouldn't consider Haitians to be Hispanic. Possibly that has to do with the fact that their dominant language is French rather than Spanish or Portuguese, but Portuguese is possibly more closely related to Spanish than French, but it's actually quite similar to French as well. So all of this kind of implies to me that this classification system is pretty incoherent. There is no great way of defining what it means to be Hispanic or Latinx, whether it's a matter of ancestry, whether it's a matter of language, whether it's a matter of geography. Haney López, in his book, talks about his biracial ancestry. His father, I believe, was of European white descent. His mother was Ecuadorian from Latin America. And so he does mention, although doesn't deeply engage with the issues of being biracial. But I can tell you today that compared to me, his background is simple. So for those who don't know me well, and those who do, you should know that I am interested in genetics. I have an adjunct appointment here at the University of Utah in the Department of Human Genetics. And one of the areas in law that I think about and write about is the effect of genetics on law. And so I am a big fan of the direct consumer genetic and ancestry testing services, and I have subscribed to most of them. And they show things that are very interesting. So let me share with you my Ancestry DNA genetic ancestry profile. This is where my ancestors come from. You will see that this is a snapshot. I've actually cut off the Western Hemisphere because my ancestry is either Spanish. The sort of Kelly green part here is Spain. We knew about that. My father is a first generation Cuban. He was born in Cuba, but his mother, during the Spanish Civil War, left Spain with her family to settle in Cuba, which at the time seemed like a more peaceful place. They were so wrong, which is why they fled to the United States in the late 1950s. Nevertheless, their background is Spanish. However, my grandfather, also from Cuba, was of Lebanese descent, and there is, interestingly, a Lebanese Christian enclave in Havana, which he was a part of, which gives me about a quarter Lebanese descent. My mother was a Chinese American and met my father in New York, where they both lived at the time. They got married there, and again, that is where I was born. Her grandparents were from China. They immigrated to the US in the early 20th century, but there's a catch there as well, in that my great-grandmother, my mother's grandmother, was Dutch. Why is this? Well, because as those who know Chinese history know, in Canton, now known as Guangzhou, there is a significant Dutch trading colony, descended from, of course, the Dutch East India Company, and she was of Dutch origin and descent, lived in China, married my great-grandfather, and they immigrated to the United States, again, in the first years of the 20th century. So this is a rather complicated mix, and it sometimes makes me ask, am I Hispanic? My name, Jorge Luis Contreras, is certainly Spanish, and my father's family speaks Spanish. I speak Spanish. But if you look at this list, Spain accounts for only 17% of my geographic ancestry. 23andMe actually provides a much more interesting roadmap, and actually one that I think is a little bit more accurate. This map is chromosome by chromosome. We have 23 of them, of course, and you can find genetic markers that link back to these different ancestral regions. And so again, a slightly different mix, but shows roughly the same thing. So I have this weird mix: Chinese, Spanish, Lebanese, Dutch. What does this all mean in terms of any kind of ethnic identity? Well, you know, for those who really know me, you will also not be surprised to see this. 23andMe also, if you ask for it, will tell you how much Neanderthal ancestry you have. For those who don't know, Neanderthals were a species of ancient hominids who interbred with Homo sapiens many years ago, 40,000 years ago, according to this slide. And we still carry Neanderthal DNA. And lo and behold, I've got more of it than most people. Again, which should not be a surprise to those of you who know me. But what does all of this combined mean, other than the fact that I am an unfrozen caveman lawyer? So, Cuban and Chinese. This is a combination that happens to be known. There are a few Cuban Chinese restaurants, none here in Utah. In fact, I still have yet to find a Cuban restaurant here in Utah, which saddens me deeply. But over the years, my friends have come up with a variety of ethnic labels that could be applied to me. Hispasian is one of them. Chino Latino, this actually is something that you will hear elsewhere. There is actually a Chinese Cuban thing. There are people who consider themselves to be Chinese Cubans, and in Havana, there is a small Chinese community, which is where this Chino Latino cuisine comes from, but that is not my community, right? My father immigrated to the US and met my mostly Chinese American mother here in the US, not in Cuba. And so all of this leads me to ask, who cares? Why does this matter? Why does classification per se make any difference at all? And should it? And so Haney López's book does address this issue, and I think in a very nice way. Why have we historically cared about these racial classifications? There are the legal issues, right? And so Nick and Arturo have talked about these. This is where we get slavery in the 19th century, but we also get the immigration-based classifications that we're still dealing with today. There's also a strong component of social classification. People self-classify into communities that they feel they belong to, they do not belong to. This is not always a benign sort of social classification. This sort of classification does lead to racism, systemic racism, and a whole variety of phenomena that we see. But again, as an amateur geneticist, I am also interested in the biological aspects of this. Do racial differences have a meaning in terms of biology? And most importantly, can racial classifications inform medical treatment? If you've been to the doctor recently or filled out any kind of medical form, you know that racial information is collected by the government and by medical providers very regularly. Why is that? You would think that if the medical governmental establishment is collecting this information, they must be doing it for some biomedical reason, or that's what you might be led to believe. We know, of course, that our physical morphology, the color of our skin, the texture of our hair, these sorts of things, they are clearly genetic, they are hereditary, they can be changed, obviously, at a gross level, but it is, at this point, not possible to change them at a cellular level. But of course, as Arturo and Nick have mentioned already, what we consider to be race goes well beyond pure morphology. It is a rather arbitrary and context-specific set of social groupings. We can group people into races in a variety of different ways. Are the two white people the same race? So this guy on the top, is he in the same race? Is he a part of that same race? You know, what about these two? Would he be included, right? It is fairly arbitrary. And even in terms of skin tone, you know, the Pantone Corporation, which we know as the entity that defines and standardizes our colors, has standardized the colors of human skin, but we really don't refer to these, right? We have a very crude and gross approximation of this, even in terms of skin color. These are arbitrary classifications. Nevertheless, as I mentioned, health providers and the government routinely collect and report health outcomes and conditions based on race. Asthma. Why is asthma have anything to do with being Black or Hispanic or Asian? Why would diabetes? As anyone with any medical or biological training will tell you, the color of one's skin is not related in any way to these conditions, nor is hair texture, as much as having freckles or connected earlobes would be related to your lung capacity or your ability to process insulin. Nevertheless, this data is collected. And of course, we see this constantly in the current COVID-19 pandemic. What is happening here? Is this for biological reasons? Is there a medical significance to race? One problem that we have in thinking about this is that indeed there are some very rare correlations between the traditional racial categories and disease conditions. Sickle cell disease is the primary example of this, which we've known for 100 years. It is prevalent in communities of African descent. The sickle cells were, they help provide immunity to malaria, which is why this cellular defect was not selected out in those populations. There are some others that track, but that is a tiny minority of disease conditions. In almost all cases, skin, hair color, facial features have no correlation to health conditions. In fact, most race disease correlations, as I think all of us know, they are really proxies for social conditions. If we are seeing people of a particular racial category with a higher prevalence of certain disease outcomes, it is because of things like poverty, lack of nutrition, the environment, access to healthcare, so forth. And last but not least, provider bias, which is a real thing. These are the determinants of these health outcomes, which correlate with some racial classifications only because social and economic status and these other social factors also track these due not to biological factors, but due to social factors. Race itself has little medical significance. And so in the medical literature and the scientific disciplines today, there is a raging debate. Some of these articles are from just a few weeks ago, and all from this year, about the debate in the collection and reporting of race and ethnicity data in medical and science journals. Why do we do it, and should we continue to do it? My view on this is no. There is no biological or medical reason to engage in this racial classification. It is, as an activity itself, incoherent. It lacks biological effect. I would, for the reasons stated earlier, I would certainly eliminate racial classification for legal reasons, as Haney López does. I would also eliminate it for biological reasons. And to the extent that there is racial classification, this is not going to go away in our society. It is purely, in my view, a social phenomenon that can stand a lot of improvement. But I think that is probably, in my view, the sole reason that we should be engaging in this classification effort and abandon official legal and medical collection and classification. That's it. So I thank you very much for the opportunity to talk with you about this really fascinating and engaging subject.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed the panelists and their comments, and certainly have learned a lot. Very thought-provoking. So again, just by way of reminder, we have about 12 minutes for questions. You'll see at the bottom of your screen the Q&A button, so feel free to enter into any questions. So I'll get us started with questions. So it was mentioned earlier that the book, White by Law, hasn't been updated since 2006. If the author did an update today in 2021, what do you think he would have to say, or what do you think, what updates would we see? Would we see any updates on this medical research or the immigration matters that George and Nick chatted about, or would there be other developments that might be covered?
I'm happy to chime in. I think, again, the perils of putting yourself in someone else's mind. And I don't know the author personally, but I think he would be no less frustrated today than he was a decade ago, or 20 years ago, or 25 years ago, when the book was originally published. The concerns he, I think, expresses about pervasive racism and the advantages that it's been gained, and then the solidification of those advantages through the use of what is now termed colorblindness, right, in the law, have not been addressed in any meaningful way. And so the same sort of systemic racist outcomes are being perpetuated, largely because the system has been set up to those advantages, and there has been nothing done to unwind those advantages. And I get that there's a lot of questions about fairness in that process, but nonetheless, I don't think the underlying idea from Haney López has changed. I also don't think his view of white transparency, right, this sort of idea that if you're white, you don't have race because you simply don't think of yourself in the context of race, is a really important concept. I think for and for whites, it often, and I think Haney López speaks to this, that it explains in many ways the frustration whites have at times when issues of race come up. And there's a sort of, why are they always talking about race? Why is that always coming up? It's not that big of a deal. Well, it's because they live in a world without race. Whereas everyone who is not white lives in a world that has significant, or at least potentially significant, impacts of race on those people's lives. And that dichotomy is hard to resolve because it is your lived experience of being non-white. And so that idea of racial transparency, I think he would also say that hasn't really meaningfully changed in our society.
I just have a couple things that I think the author would probably also have a few things to say about some politicians' almost explicit appeal to nativism. I think that's grown a lot more since the time he published his book, and I have a feeling that he would probably have something to say about that and how it ties almost directly to the appeal of nativism that occurred during the time of the topics that he discussed in the book.
Yeah, I would say, you know, I would agree with Arturo about the white transparency. I mean, certainly, as we've seen over the last few years, there has been a horrifying resurgence of white identity in the most negative way. I think that was not as much of an issue in the early 2000s as it was beginning in 2016. And so, so I think that's a big one. I also think he's somewhat conflicted in terms of whether this legal classification of whiteness is something that should be done away with entirely. And on the pro side of it, he finds affirmative action programs and the elimination of discrimination in an affirmative way. And I think that, now 15 years later, I think that, well, I don't know what he would think. I think that those programs, they don't, certainly they don't outweigh the harms. I don't know how much benefit they've actually done when we look back, and I have to say from the perspective of, from a personal standpoint, I have benefited from affirmative action programs of many kinds in my childhood and as a student. But those were not government imposed programs. Those were socially based programs. And I think that the government's efforts to classify race have just never helped that much. I think that's something that, now we have more hindsight to use to look back.
It's a really interesting point, George. I would certainly agree. I myself have definitely benefited from affirmative action context. And so it is interesting to reflect and see what impact those programs have had in the past. So we have a question from Virginia Lee, who says, on March 13th, 2021, I tuned into an MD Edge podcast where a psychiatrist interviewed another psychiatrist who had several decades of study interaction with white supremacists. Generally, white supremacists have experienced either childhood emotional, physical, or sexual abuse and have been radicalized to white supremacist thought and culture. Any comments on this?
My only comment would be that, I think it's always best to try to exercise empathy and put yourself in someone else's shoes to see how they became the person that they are. Other than that, I don't have a whole lot to say.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know the study. It sounds fascinating, and it might indeed have something to say about people today who identify as white supremacists. But certainly, I think that it's very clear that the idea of white supremacy, certainly. Looking at my Spanish heritage goes back to the 1400s, if not far beyond that. The Spanish have had a long history of racial conflict. The Moors, as you know, from Africa, occupied Spain for many years, which led to ongoing and continuing racial animosity that has nothing to do with those social factors that might be affecting today. But this is a long historical path that I think we should try to overcome. But I wouldn't minimize it by attributing it simply to people with emotional disturbances, although they undoubtedly exist.
Yeah, and I think, to the first point about the abuse that had been suffered by those people. Again, I'm not familiar with the study, so I can't really speak to it. I think to the second concept, it reinforces, I think, the point that Haney López was making, is that race, right? So race and racism are social concepts, right? The biological differences that George spoke to, genetic differences. And I think at times we use the terms that have grown up around racism as proxies for groups of people that tend to have those genetic traits, right? So we say that sickle cell, and then we say, okay, so that has to do with being Black, even though being Black is not really the relevant criteria, right? It's not the color of the skin, it's something else that's operating. So you end up with those kinds of social proxies. So I think this idea that white supremacist racism, and the racism that, again, in my personal view, I think is still pervasive in this country, it's a learned thing. And it's a learned thing that is learned not just, explicitly, but also implicitly, and it becomes normalized. It becomes how we think about things. And I think that there's really good research. If you've ever done the test, I think it's at Harvard, where you sort of, you do this scale and you're looking at a set of images and you're quickly clicking based on those images. If you look at, in my world, in careers, the resume study that was done where, several thousand resumes were sent out, the only distinction being a traditionally presumed to be white sounding name and a traditionally presumed to be ethnic sounding name. And the ethnic sounding names got far, far less offers of interviews than the white sounding names. And I don't think someone was sitting in an office saying, oh my God, this person is African American, or this person's Hispanic or Latinx or whatever, and I'm not going to interview them. I just think it is happening almost underneath what they can even imagine. And it continues to happen and move forward.
Yeah. Well, we have 3 minutes left, so we have time for one more question. And I think this is a great question to end on, which is from Chantel Black, who says, I know this is an overly broad question, but I'm curious what each of you would be a beginning step to correcting the social construct of race in an effort to eliminate white supremacy in our country. So maybe if each of you could answer in 1 minute or less, what would be a great first step?
I'll go first. I think a great first step is just to do what you can control. And the only thing you can control is your own choices and your own actions. So I think it has to start with how you treat people and how you receive maybe abuse from others, and just try to, like I said, be empathetic and put yourself in someone else's shoes to see why they form the opinion that they have. But I think outside yourself, I don't think there's a whole lot an individual can do to really change this issue. So I think it has to start with yourself.
Well, I'll go now. So yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think people have to do this, look within themselves, but I think the government can help too. And I think the government can help by stopping the racial classification, the census, all of the health data that's collected. I think the government should jettison all of this and, form aid programs around actual income disparities and educational disparities, health disparities, but don't use race as a proxy for these. I mean, one observation that I have made in recent years as teaching students here in Utah, that it is increasingly, the assumptions that you make about students based on their names or what they look like are totally wrong. And we are becoming an increasingly mixed racial culture and country. The old racial classifications from the days of the conquistadors and so forth, those don't exist anymore. And I think we should just jettison them. And if the government stops propping them up in a couple of generations, hopefully they will fall away.
And I guess I take a somewhat different view in that I think racial classification is woven into the fabric of our country and our culture and frankly our world at some level. And so I actually think the government has a role. My view of affirmative action has been you're never going to change the opinion of people, the private opinion, whether be they racist or not. But I do think there's a point at which it no longer becomes interesting when a CEO of a company comes on, whatever your news channel is, CNN or whatever, and they're Black, right? When you get to that point, then I guess I'm comfortable abandoning the idea that that racism has gotten to a point in this country where we can stop worrying about racial classification. I had a group of students at my last institution who were asked by two of our faculty, who are very esteemed faculty, wonderful people, certainly left of center, to critique an article that they had been working on around the schemas from the Supreme Court that would allow someone to work towards supporting groups that were diverse despite Supreme Court restrictions on addressing race. And they kept trying to present this to the students, and this was in a live forum, and I was privileged to sit in the room. And the president of the BALSA student group, the Black Law student group, basically continued, and all his members continued to take them to task, saying, you can't talk about race without talking about race. You can't deal with race in America without talking about race in America. And I think they're right. As wonderful as it would be to live in a colorblind world, that's not our world. And I think we need to confront that. So, and again, I think George and I largely agree, but I just actually think government action is necessary. And I would argue for it. I actually think Haney López's concerns about a colorblind society are spot on. I think it's a ruse.
Well, wonderful. Well, on that note, I really appreciate our three panelists today and want to thank them for this wonderful conversation. I know I learned a lot, very thought-provoking. So thank you so much. I also want to thank our attendees for joining us today and for this conversation. I also invite you to join us next month. So October is Disability Awareness Month. And in recognition of that, we will be reading Three Generations, No Imbeciles, Eugenics, the Supreme Court, and Buck versus Bell, which talks about how the disabled community has been or was and previously targeted by eugenics. So I encourage you to join us for that conversation. And in the meantime, I hope you have a wonderful fall and that you enjoy the week. Thanks so much.